President Trump lashing out about investigation, unleashing a series of angry attacks that began with the president blaming his own FBI for the school massacre in Florida that left 17 dead. Mr. Trump tweeting that the FBI missed signals because they are spending too much time trying to prove Russian collusion with the Trump campaign. The charge prompting criticism from a number of Republicans.
I think it's an absurd statement, okay? Absurd.
So many folks in the FBI are doing all that they can to keep us safe. The reality of it is that they are two separate issues.
The president should be staying out of law enforcement business.
Democratic Congressman Ruben Gallego calling the president a psychopath, tweeting, "America will regret the day you were ever born." President Trump also going after his own national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, who said
is now really incontrovertible.
Mr. Trump publicly scolding McMaster, saying he forgot to say that the results of the 2016 election were not impacted or changed by the Russians, a conclusion that the intelligence community hasn't reached. The president has not mentioned what, if anything, his administration is doing to retaliate against Russia or prevent them from interfering in future elections. The president asserting that the Russia probes are creating discord, disruption, and chaos rather than condemning Russia, adding they are laughing their asses off in Moscow. Mr. Trump also falsely claiming that he never said Russia did not meddle in the election, despite multiple statements that prove otherwise, including remarks aboard Air Force One in November when he said he believes Vladimir Putin when he says that Russia did not meddle in the election. Mr. Trump sarcastic Adam Schiff for saying that the Obama administration could have taken a stronger stance against Russia.
But none of that is an excuse for this president to sit on his hands.
Schiff challenging the president directly, asking if McMaster can stand up to Putin, why can't you? The president insisting special counsel Robert Mueller's indictment of 13 Russians and 3 Russian entities for attempting to sway the election vindicates him, insisting it proves there was no collusion between his campaign and Russia, despite the fact that Mueller's investigation into potential collusion is ongoing. Now, David Allison, the president is heading back to Washington this afternoon to the headline from the LA Times that former campaign aide Rick Gates is agreed to testify against the former campaign chairman Paul Manafort and is expected to plead guilty to fraud-related charges within days.
Okay, Caitlin, thank you very much for all of that reporting. Let's get to our guests. We have CNN political commentator Michael Smerconish and CNN legal analyst Michael Zeldin. He worked as a special assistant to Robert Mueller at the Department of Justice. It's great to have both of you here. Your perspectives on this. So, just in case anybody's forgotten that how many times the president has denied that he's denied Russian meddling, since he's saying that he didn't. We do have some videotape. This is why videotape's so handy. Here it is.
But I notice anytime anything wrong happens, they like to say, the Russians. She doesn't know if it's the Russians doing the hacking. Maybe there is no hacking.
And I know a lot about hacking, and hacking is a very hard thing to prove. So it could be somebody else. What I said there is that I believe he believes that, and that's very important for somebody to believe. I believe that he feels that he and Russia did not meddle in.
Well, the most troublesome aspect about his denials of this situation and his failure to accept the findings, or at least the allegations, of the Mueller indictment is that it means at the most senior level, the commander-in-chief of our government is not combating nor retaliating. I mean, Congress passed that sanctions bill against the Russians, and he refused to embrace it. So that's what troubles me most. How are we protecting ourselves against whatever's to come in the midterm election this cycle or in the 2020 re-election, presumably if he runs again? Seemingly, we're not defending ourselves.
Michael Zeldin, there were a dozen tweets from the president. We only have 2 hours left in the program, so we won't read them all. But to Michael Smerconish, there was something missing. So what are the implications of the fact no punishment, no pushback against Russia for interfering in our democracy?
Well, so these are these tweets has no bearing on his legal standing and are irrelevant to what Mueller is investigating. Mueller is inquiring as to whether or not there was a counterintelligence inquiry against the United States, and we see that in the indictment that he feels that there was. He's inquiring whether there was collusion, whether there was obstruction of justice, and whether there's connections between Trump and Russians as they attempted to interfere with the election. All that is ongoing and quite irrespective of what the president had to say on his Twitter feed.
Hey, Michael, back here at home, there is suggestions that Rick Gates, who was the deputy campaign manager, will be pleading guilty, and thereby was up to. And so even back, I mean, then he, you know, as we know, he joins the guilty pleas of Michael Flynn for lying to the FBI, George Papadopoulos. So back here at home, you know, it's interesting that 13 Russians were indicted, but a lot's happening here, too.
Exactly right. And the Gates plea, if it occurs, be to, it looks like, count one of the indictment, which is a conspiracy to defraud the United States Department of Justice and Department of Treasury by failing to register as a foreign agent and failing to declare foreign bank accounts. It's not completely tethered to the Russia counterintelligence aspect of the Mueller investigation, but it puts additional pressure on Manafort to make a decision about whether he's going to go to trial or himself cooperate. I think that Mueller would like Manafort to plead and cooperate. We see the other day, I think it was Friday of this past week, Mueller filed more information with the court about Manafort perhaps engaging in mortgage fraud. So the pressure on Manafort is growing. And I think that that's purposeful on Mueller's part because Manafort may hold a lot of keys to the information that Mueller wants as to whether or not collusion between the Trump campaign and foreign nationals.
That's interesting.
So clearly that and what's in these 36 pages, they matter, Michael Smerconish. But when I talk to people right now, they're talking about gun control. They're talking about background checks. They're talking about the lack of action in the light of what happened in Parkland, Florida. You hear from Americans each and every day.
And the question is whether this is going to last. The fact that that rally is scheduled for March 24 means that people will be galvanized at least for an additional month. I think like many, not only around the country, but around the globe, I'm just mesmerized by those students, including the two that you just had on, who speak with more poise and more conviction than most elected officials. So the intangible, X the unknown this time, is whether there will be some movement begun by the youngest voices that gives sustenance to the adults that they've not had up until now. That's the intangible. That's what I want to see.
But Michael Smerconish, does it feel different to you this time? Because it does to me. I mean, the idea that they were in Florida, the idea that this is a gun culture, obviously, in Florida in a way that it isn't in Connecticut. You know, this is there. Okay, except that they have, I think, a different attitude towards guns than they do in Connecticut, in that even the surrogate family that took this shooter in, they were gun owners. They allowed him to keep his gun because it was locked up. That's how you do it if you're a responsible gun owner. They didn't know that he had had a key made. And so I don't know, somehow the fact that these kids are so vocal and speaking out, does it feel different to you, Michael Smerconish?
It does feel different to me, and something that I think that is potentially game-changing about this tragedy is the failure of what I'll describe as data integration. And you've been reporting on so of this. The bail bondsman who last January initial phone call, a Nexus search says there were only 22 individuals with the same name as this shooter. Couldn't they run down the 22? CNN reporting that 39 times law enforcement responded to that address. The investigation by the local child services organization. They're being troublesome in the Ethernet that it just begs for, in a Google, Amazon, Facebook world in which we live, the ability to tie it all together and give law enforcement the tools that they need to do their job. That's not a Second Amendment issue. You know, that's just working smart, not working hard.
Yeah, it's difficult for people to understand that we can track down Russian interference in our election, but we can't follow up on simple tips. If you're a parent and you lost a loved one there, you must be struggling with that. The president had his take on how these two things overlap. Here's the tweet. Very sad that the FBI missed all of the many signals sent out by the Florida school shooter. This is not acceptable. That is true. They are spending too much time trying to prove Russian collusion with the Trump campaign. No collusion. Get back to the basics.
As a decade-long federal prosecutor, is that the FBI has enough competence to do both things at the same time. What happened here in this case has to be inquired of. I don't know why that tip wasn't followed up on yet, but it's not because resources of the FBI were diverted to Russia. And if it is in fact true that the Russian investigation is drawing out additional resources, then put a budget in to get more resources into the FBI. It's not connected in that respect. And I have to say one thing. I don't like to talk about politics, but the one law that I would change if I were trying to get gun control is campaign finance law. I would change law so that these politicians aren't so tethered to the need for money, so that they could actually take principled stands on issues, which I think a lot of these guys feel, but just can't break away from the milk of their livelihood, which is raising money.
Well, it's not just the NRA, it is their constituents. It is a passionate issue for people across this country that vote. Some people vote exclusively on gun rights. We need to keep that as part of the conversation. It's not merely the FBI, not merely the NRA.
Fair enough. I mean, obviously, this is.
I didn't say it. I didn't say it was the NRA.
No, I know you did not.
That principles get interfered with when money is the lifeblood of your life as a politician.
True statement. Michael Zeldin. Thank you both very much for the perspective.
All right, the survivors of that.
Good morning, Dave. There is so much passion. There was so much pain here in this community that student survivors are taking that energy and they're demanding gun control. They want a ban on the type of weapon that was used to kill 17 people here, and they also are calling for a ban on high-capacity magazines that increase carnage. And they are not afraid to call out politicians who are funded by the NRA, even if that politician is the President of the United States.
How dare you? Children are dying and their blood is on your hands because of that. Please, take action.
Survivors of last week's high school massacre criticizing President Trump for his inaction on gun control and voicing their outrage over the president's tweet blaming the FBI for missed signals about the killer because of the Russia investigation. One student tweeting, 17 of my classmates are gone, but you're right. It always has to be about you. How silly of me to forget. Hashtag never again. Another writing, you are the President of the United States, and you have the audacity to put this on Russia as an excuse? I guess I should expect that from you. The FBI admitted Friday that it failed to act on a specific tip it received on January 5th, when a person killer told the Bureau he was erratic, owned guns, had a desire to kill people, and was potentially capable of conducting a school shooting.
On behalf of myself and over 1,000 employees of the Miami field office, we truly regret any additional pain that this has caused.
The Parkland community laying their loved ones to rest, emotions running high, many students turning their grief into calls for action. investigation from Florida's Department of Children and Families raised behavioral concerns about the killer in September of 2016, including that he was on Snapchat, cutting both of his arms, had a Nazi symbol drawn on his backpack, and wanted to purchase a gun for unknown reasons. According to the report, the killer had been diagnosed with autism, ADHD, and depression, and investigators questioned how frequently he was taking his medication, but a safety assessment ultimately determined the level of risk was low. These documents also show that the killer was cited in over 40 disciplinary incidents at school, including fighting, profane language, assault, disruption, and suspension, with many school officials advising further counseling and threat assessment referrals. This new chilling surveillance video captures the confessed killer walking calmly down the street minutes after the attack. The family that took in the killer telling walking calmly down the street minutes after the attack. The family that took in the killer telling the Sun Sentinel, "We had this monster living under our roof and we didn't know. Everything everybody seems to know, we didn't know." The Sneeds say he followed every house rule but was depressed and took him to a therapist just 5 days before the shooting. They allowed him to keep firearms, including an AR-15, in the family's locked safe, but they thought they had the only key.
And as we take a live look here in Parkland, you can see that there is a memorial that continues to grow. The street here in front of the school was opened yesterday, and that's why people have been able to come and pay their respect.
Your job is to protect us, and our blood is on your hands.
Those are just some of the students who survived that school massacre in Parkland, Florida. They're demanding change, and they're taking their message to Washington, D.C. on March 24th for what they hope will be a...
Good morning, Allison.
So listen, I mean, the students couldn't say it any better, but when you hear what Senator Rubio said, I mean, in the hours after this school shooting, he said basically, well, I mean, I'll just let him say it. I won't even quote it. Here's what he said right after that on Thursday.
If someone's decided I'm going to commit this crime, they'll find a way to get the gun to do it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have a law that makes it harder. It just means understand, to be honest. It isn't going to stop this from happening. You could still pass the law, per se, but you're still going to have these horrible attacks.
He thinks that a law wouldn't stop it from happening. What do you say to that?
Well, I mean, it's just one of the many absurdities we hear from those people like Marco Rubio, like the Speaker of the House, who was in Florida last week and didn't bother to stop by and hear from people who suffered this tragedy. It's one of the many, many absurdities. I mean, think about the point. Well, okay, just because people are going to commit murder or just because they're going to, commit larceny, gosh, that we shouldn't pass those laws. Of course we should. And Allison, what makes this particularly tragic is that there's things that we could do that have, 3/4 to 90% of the American public behind them. Things like universal background check, just making sure you can't buy a gun unless you've had a check, making sure that nobody has access to a 20-round magazine. I could go on and on and on. But the point is, for guys like Marco Rubio, it's muscle memory, because they know that if they change their tune, that they will have to deal with the NRA. And that's why, young men like on your air make me feel so good. Young people now standing up and joining adults who've been banging this drum for a very long time. I don't know if it's going to make a difference. The Congress is a very, very hard place.
The facts don't support what Marco Rubio was saying. Look at Connecticut. I mean, after Connecticut, I don't have to tell you, that's your state. After Newtown, everybody thought things would change. Congress couldn't figure out how to do it, so your state of Connecticut did it on its own. And when they passed more strict gun laws, gun deaths went down in Connecticut. There's a direct correlation. Why don't some senators realize that?
Well, the facts are incontrovertible here, and I mean, there's just example after example. In the 1990s, when there was a brutal mass killing in Australia, Australia passed laws that made it much harder to get your hands on weapons of war, like the AR-15, which was used in this and so many other school killings, and they haven't had any other since then. Since the mid-90s, they had this sort of thing in Australia. So the problem is people like Marco Rubio and Speaker Ryan, and sad to say, most Republicans in Congress, and to be fair, a few Democrats, they can't allow the conversation to go to facts. This is why the NRA puts up videos that try to scare Americans. They go to emotions. They go to fear. You know, people want to take away. Nobody wants to take away people's guns. We just don't want to be any different than Canada or Australia or Great Britain, where you can get guns, you just get checked out, you can't get weapons of war. They have reasonable, yes, mental health systems that allow for the identification of people like the shooter in Sandy Hook or this individual in Florida. There is a lot that we could do that would bring this to a close. The problem is that people like Marco Rubio and Speaker Ryan will not allow that conversation to happen.